Hello, hello, hello. Good evening, good afternoon. Hello, everybody. I think everybody can hear me. Good. Is this good enough? Too loud? Okay.
See, there are 3 more seats up here in the front for somebody if they'd like. Okay, we have microphones in all the right places. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, welcome. First, a few housekeeping details. The emergency exits are the same way you came in through the building, right out through the back, through the double doors. There are 3 restrooms in this building. One is in the lobby to the left as you're exiting this room. 2 more are down the stairs to the right as you're exiting this lobby. We ask that everybody take a moment and double check that all your cell phones are muted, please. This would be that moment. Cell phones out, switches off. Thank you. We also respectfully request that everyone except Shumei's media staff refrain from using cameras or any electronic recording devices during this afternoon's panel discussion. We are grateful for your cooperation. Living in harmony with nature. It was falling on our heads earlier today. Quite a natural day. The theme of the Shumei Crestone Center's 17th anniversary and the jumping off point for this afternoon's panel discussion. After spending a couple hours with our moderator and our panelists yesterday, I found myself wanting to rename this weekend's theme to Living as Nature. As one of today's panelists pointed out in yesterday's conversation, harmony implies that we and nature are somehow separated. Not only is nature not something that only exists outside of this room, we ourselves are nature. And it is my humble opinion that so many of the troubles facing our species and our planet today stem from this simple but profound disconnection, treating nature as other. Rather than trying to summarize these 4 people's bios as introduction, instead, I invite you, if you have not already done so, to read them in your programs at your leisure. Given that I have known and worked with, in one way or another, all of our 3 panelists today in my 15 years living in Crestone, I want to share with you a few brief personal insights about my experience with them and what I see as interesting commonalities as well as differences in form and approach. Beside the fact that all 3 of today's panelists have called Crestone home for decades, all 3 have something in common that I would like to put in this way. They all have a deep, abiding respect and concern for nature. I think it's fair to say that they realize their part in, and that ultimately that they are nature. Each of them have devoted significant portions of their lives to nature, but I think in interestingly different ways. John Milton, panelist to your right, was involved in one of the earliest reports pointing toward human-caused climate change that was published more than 50 years ago. He has since introduced, or perhaps reintroduced, people in the thousands or probably tens of thousands to nature and their own inner nature through ceremony and immersive short and long-term retreats and solo experiences in nature. These people range from so-called common everyday men and women to political and commercial leaders of Fortune 500 companies. Zenki Christian Dillo Roshi, second from the left, with the best haircut, has devoted his life to the practice of Zen Buddhism and the lineage of Suzuki Roshi. Christian has assumed the role of head teacher from Richard Baker Roshi at the Crestone Mountain Zen Center. In recent years, Christian has begun speaking and teaching publicly about what he sees as the planetary ecological crisis that we are facing and what he intends to do about it. He has incorporated what he calls wild Dharma trips into his teachings and has committed to making the Zen Center's Crestone facilities, right next door to Shumei, carbon neutral. When I talk about Christine Canali, second from right, When I talk about Chris to people who might not know her, I often say that I do not know of any other single individual who has done more to protect and advocate for nature in the greater San Luis Valley. I stand by that statement today. For 30 years, Chris's devotion to nature has taken the form of environmental activism, leadership, and stewardship. The one person today that I have not known and worked with for the past 15 years is our moderator, Warwick Manfrenato, although I have sure enjoyed getting to know him over the last few days and weeks. Weeks via internet and days and driving in cars and whatnot. Once again, I direct you to your programs and encourage you to rejoin us tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. when Warwick will deliver his own presentation, and you will learn more about his life and connections to Crestone. For now, I will share this about Warwick. Born in Brazil, father of two, his 18-year-old daughter, Kiara, who saw snow for the first time in her life the other day, is here with us today. Thank you for that, Kiara. Warwick is a small-scale farmer, agronomist, engineer, and musician. His mother, French-Portuguese, his father, third-generation Brazilian-Italian, are also both musicians. Warwick has been involved in large and small ways in his own community and on the world stage with climate change and ecological preservation. He has done so individually, through the United Nations, as a government minister in Brazil, through carbon trade, and in a number of other ways. In a lively conversation I had on our drive down from Denver earlier this week, Warwick said to me, "If you didn't want provocative and perhaps controversial, you should not have invited an Italian to moderate your panel." So hold on to your seats. The last thing I wish to say is that in the planning of today's panel discussion, we had initially imagined that it would include some audience interaction. Just yesterday, after I was mostly bearing witness to another very lively and provocative conversation over lunch, in which our three panelists met Warwick for the first time, it became clear that this is a huge and wide-ranging topic, and that these four had more than enough interesting perspectives, insights, and things to say to fill our limited time today. I apologize in advance if some of you may feel disappointed. Rather than try to give these four people an even more limited time to respond to a small number of questions from the audience, we instead invite you to bring forth your questions, insights, and views into longer and more diverse conversations among yourselves, your families, friends, strangers, communities, and the world. There will, however, be an opportunity for questions to Warwick during his presentation tomorrow afternoon. We hope that today's panel discussion inspires the challenging conversations that we need to be having every day in small groups and on the world stage. And with that, I turn over the stage to our moderator, Warwick Manfrenato.
Thank you very much, Matthew. After your words, I have to confess to you, it's a very discomforting for me to be here in a certain way, because the job is a big one. I feel very honored to Shumei for having invited me, Alan, Eugene, Stephen, for having created such a great friendship. As Matthew said, I have some relationship with Crestone for a long time through Hannah and Maurice Strong, dear friends of mine. I met with them in '91 while I was living in New York City, working for a mining operation from Brazil, and meeting them, they invited me to be at the Earth Summit in '92, and from then on, not only my life changed, but many things I had the opportunity to do. Today here, my role is very specific. I am a moderator. I feel like I have three major, top-of-the-line horses ready to jump on a track, and I have to basically hold them a little bit, and I have a watch, which I don't have, but more or less I have to control the time and see that the conversation that started yesterday, for the first time we had an opportunity to have conversation, that we create an opportunity to engage here and create a relationship with the audience somehow. As Matthew said, we had some idea of how to go within the next hour and a half or two, depending on how ready everybody is to not raise hands and ask questions, but anyways, how we could end this with a message to all of us, not from us to you. That's not something that I was able to understand from the conversation. Yes, we are not here to teach. We're not here to preach. We're not here to give messages one way. As a matter of fact, separation from nature was one of the first things that we said we cannot do. I mean, we cannot create a narrative that takes us away from being part of nature. And with that, I'd like to start by saying that we basically discussed having two topics in general terms. One is regarding leadership, how leadership in the world today, leadership for the needed change that, of course, basically, regarding climate change, regarding global warming, regarding the deterioration of something that relates to the process of civilization that has been going on for thousands of years. And I here see many cultures that are present in Crestone, are present in the lives of every one of you, that we see some very moment of deterioration, a turning point of moment for the planet. And I think this is a great opportunity for us to bring that on stage and create some a new point of in the path for all of us. For me, it is a strong point of turning directions, maybe, of awareness building. And in that way, being very specific without rumbling about what we're going to do. And I proposed to them yesterday that we discuss. Each one of them would speak about some of these ideas and create a dialogue here on stage. Maybe you watch more than participate, but as Matthew indicated, what we want is to create a moment in which movement takes a new step in a cycle. Basically, that's it. So in that way, very humbly, I would like to ask each one, Chris, and John, to speak to you what leadership in a moment like this is. I have, as I said, Kiara, my daughter, I have a very strong relationship with teenagers these days. It's one of my main jobs these days, to take care of my two kids with 18 and 12 and 19 years old. And one of the things that I feel very deeply about them, about the youth that circle my house, is that they have a very strange relationship with leadership. It's hard for us to see these guys, and everybody, I'd say, in this audience, to trust government, to trust science, to trust whoever is raising hands saying, I'm the leader, be it in a government, be it in a president in a state or municipality, be in a group of people that we enjoy being together. So leadership is something that youth particularly has been looking for in Google, in the cloud. And there's a big mistake about leadership, wisdom, and information. You may find information a lot available today. But to jump from information to wisdom, to knowledge, is something very strange, the way the current moment on our society is. So as Matthew said, I provoked. I sort of poked this point to our three panelists. And I said, what about leadership? How do we look at leadership these days in our planet towards a global change that is needed? And there were some very interesting things that came up already. And I'm sure this is not going to be a new day. This is perhaps going to be a continuation of what was yesterday, but also a lot of new things will come up. So with that, I'm going to try to speak as little as possible. As you see, I speak a lot. But I would like to ask each one of us, maybe in the same order, or whoever feels like jumping in, to continue or to speak about leadership.
Well, I think it's really interesting that we're having a day when we have a snowstorm, beautiful bright sun, and freezing cold, all coming together, and thunder, all coming together during the same day. Before I came over here, I've just been doing awareness training with a group of people that are going out to do their Vision Quest tomorrow. And we do this about once a month. And we start with, in our leadership training process, we begin with first going into a deep training of some of the common ground principles of meditation and spiritual practice, but with a focus on how to connect to nature, inner nature, outer nature, and true nature. And in that process, we suggest some ways to go about that seem to have worked in many cultures around the planet. Then there's a period when they literally drop out of human culture for a while. There's no buildings. Often there's no tents. There's just you and nature, and you have a week of complete solitude, surrounded by the animals, the plants, the elements, the beings of the natural world that we're all part of. And for many, this is the first time they've spent more than a few hours alone in nature, much less going out for a deep immersion in nature and what it has to offer and how it has to teach. And then at the conclusion of that process, we come back together again and share. And we work with the process of tempering to take the insights and the wisdom that has arisen and the opening of the heart that has arisen in people. And we share that together, and we explore approaches to take that back out into culture. I like to take everybody down to the cloud and the desert sage, and maybe sometimes one of the local bars. And when you're fresh from that deep immersion in the natural state, to then begin to see that that functions in the same way, potentially, as when you're out in the middle of the wild. And so then we go back and forth. They go back into the wilderness again for a period of time, then go back into the city and back and forth. And I've named that process tempering, just like you temper a sword. And the result of that is usually a capacity for integration among leaders. I've been working with quite a few folks around the planet over the years, and but that tempering process is very important and often neglected, I've noticed, in other training processes. So we emphasize that. The other thing I wanted to emphasize is the fact that if you haven't spent time deeply alone in nature, this is one of the keys. It's no accident that most indigenous cultures have profound ecological wisdom that permeates their culture. One of the reasons they have that is they go deep into nature in a sacred way. They make the connection to the rest of life very clear, and the teachings of the rest of life begin to pour through them. And they receive the insights of what's their purpose for this lifetime, how can they improve their connectivity to that process of the gift of this life, and then how to make a deep dive into the essence of the truth of themselves at the deepest level. And I think it's for that reason that many of these indigenous cultures have this extraordinary capacity to bring us the ecological wisdom that is so rare and hard to find in these times, because they've spent thousands of years tapping into that, bringing that wisdom out, and then finding ways to share that within their culture and now with many of the rest of us. So we've tried in our training process to take some of those pearls and find the common ground of that, so we can not be culture bound by one particular culture, and then share from that common ground aspect, and also including, of course, many of the great traditions of Buddhism and Taoism and non-dual Advaita Vedanta and Christianity and Islam and so on. But finding what is the common ground so we don't have to argue about who's got the best pathway to profound connection to the rest of life. And then from that, we've learned that over a period of years, as you begin to access true nature aspect, which many people in this community are very much engaged in, the Zen Center is doing fantastic work along this line, for example. As you approach, the creativity that begins to rise is extraordinary. And we've learned that the kind of creativity that comes up as you take that deep dive in towards source in nature is a very ecologically conscious kind of creativity. And so many of the people that have gone out from the process, Chris was one of those people way back when.
30 years ago.
She was a campground host up here in the North Crestone Creek campground. She came out of she was watching people go through the process. Came over at the end of that and said, John, I want some of that.
Yeah, it was my 30th birthday,
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
And I'd never spent time alone
Yeah.
by myself for a week, because I grew up with 8 people in a very small house. So that was just an amazing experience.
So we set up a custom retreat for this clearly emergent leader. And 9 months after she finished that retreat, maybe she can share about what happened. That's not my place. But she went on to become one of the major leaders in the battle to save the water of this valley. Just to show you.
If I may ask you specifically, the way you describe your work and some of these trainings that people come and take, it's wonderful. I'm curious as to your consideration in terms of people who seek, people who find out that you do what you do, and come to you looking for an experience that you have a relationship with, somehow got to know about you. But what about the world in which people live oblivious of such a tool, and which obviously is the majority of people? And how, if you could just put some consideration to that, I mean, how can that mass of people be touched? How do we do that?
Well, a good example, I think, is on our website, at the Way of Nature website, we have a little screen, and across the screen comes a little banner that says, "Why settle for virtual reality?" And that banner is the kind of the lead banner for the engagement in connection to the true aspect of the natural world that we're all part of. So, of course, because I put that banner up, I ended up being the teacher of a group called Full Sail University, which are the leaders in virtual reality construction. They train on the folks that handle the sound, the visuals, and the music, the film that we see permeating most of the planet these days. And I find myself in a very interesting position where we had a leader of that. I was invited to come up and meet with the president of that university to see how we could find a common ground. And as a result of that meeting, we've ended up training a lot of the department heads in how to refine the perceptions, how to work with the refinement process that we've kind of specialized in, and merge that with their work in refining sight and sound especially. Of course, we go on to work with touch and taste and smell and balance and movement and the perception of energy and the way emotions display in the flow of thought. All of those arise, of course, from the source. So a lot of our focus is on first refining those processes so that you begin to become one with whatever the apparent outward form of nature is. And then through the process of meditation with those form aspects, you begin to bond with them at a very deep level, or realize your natural bond. And then when you go a little deeper and you establish that in your Vision Quest site, then suddenly you begin to realize that all of this has the opportunity or the invitation to come back into the pure source of pure awareness that lies at the heart of the arising of all these form aspects. And as I mentioned before, when leaders do this, the creativity that arises, the ecological creativity, is immense. Chris is a perfect example of that. And a brilliant example. So I often actually mention her experience at the outset of a training because of that. So these folks are now talking about doing a global concert where Beyonce and Cardi B, some of the people that they train, they work with, people of that order can go out and begin to work with creating music and film and sound that inspires a natural connection to the rest of life and to our natural ecosystems that we're all part of. And obviously, if we can entrain music and film in a outreach to many people who've had no connection to nature in a sacred way, this could be very, very inspiring. I mean, the work of this guy down here with nature is extraordinary. His photography is fantastic in opening up a different view of how nature can be in a sacred way. So these tools of photography, film, cinematography, and sound and music are extraordinary. And through them, if we learn how to refine especially the perceptions in that nature connection training process, then you can go very deep into very powerful means for opening up a new kind of connection to the rest of life, which obviously is needed right now. We're pretty much out of touch.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, thank you for that, John. It really was a profound experience, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that because it is very personal, but I will have to say that what ended up happening to me is I ended up dealing with a lot of fear. And it's amazing what the mind does to itself, and you are in nature, and I just found nature to be so comforting. And as thoughts came up, and in my case, you know, my mind wouldn't stop chattering. And after a couple days, it got very irritating. And, you know, I would say to myself, you know, because you're dealing with these voices, and you get familiar with them, you know, you're not saying anything to me. Would you just stop? And then, all of a sudden, I started hearing this flute. And it would just follow me wherever I went. And then that started frightening me. Because I thought, oh my God, I'm losing my mind. And then I decided to celebrate it. And it was just like dancing naked with the sky and the stars and feeling so free and so wonderful and so connected. But anyway, I'm giving you the quick version. But the reason that I moved here was with Mark, and we decided to come here because we were going to build our own house. And we figured that would probably be the only way that we could probably ever really have any sort of stability. And Mark is, you know, Mr. Builder Extraordinaire, and I was like willing to go along with it. And that was an incredibly profound experience because I began to understand what do we really need to survive. And we were living on, just so you know, about $500 a month, and we've continued to live on as little as possible. I know that's not the big thing right now. You know, everybody's trying to, you know, acquire so that you can retire. But to me, it's about living as minimally as possible so that you can actually live sustainably because, you know, you're only living on what you're making. And then you find out you really don't need very much. It's amazing how little you actually need. Anyway, I decided, and it was something that was shared to me by a man who lived here and his wonderful wife, Richard and Mary Johnston. And Richard was a philosophy professor from the Midwest, and he read a poem to me. And I decided to read it today because it really encapsulated, I feel, where we are right now. And it's written by William Butler Yeats, and you probably are familiar with it if you ever read The Second Coming. This was written in 1921, right after World War I, about 100 years ago. Turning and turning into the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. I hadn't been able to find that because I couldn't remember what Richard was even referring to when he read it, but it really stuck with me. And all of a sudden, as I was trying to prepare for this, I'm taking care of my mother, and I'm staying in a house that has full of books. It's just amazing. And there's a book that just, you know how the title just jumps out. And this one was called The Leaderless Revolution. Carne Ross, who was actually a diplomat, a British diplomat. Anyway, I really believe what he's saying in terms of this is really where we're going in the 21st century. You're the leaders. Everybody sitting here is the leaders. We're gonna come together as a team. We're all gonna have different ideas, but we're all gonna come together and manifest what needs to happen next. And it's gonna come in all different kinds of ways. It's gonna be very organic. It's gonna be very sloppy in some ways. Some stuff is gonna work, some stuff isn't. But that's how it's really gonna happen. And I wanted to read from some climate scientists who I found very comforting. One is a climate scientist, and the other is a poet laureate. And this is really, to me, a very grounding way to move forward. It is an immense privilege to be alive at this time. We owe it to ourselves to try hard as we can to understand what is going on and to give meaning to it. Only by understanding our lives as meaningful can we hope to create meaningful change. That's the riddle. To grasp the problem, we have to slow down. To respond to it, we have to act fast. The ambiguity you mentioned. We have both no time and more time. Climate change is a slope, and we can ease our descent. I could start talking about some examples of this, but I really want to keep it conceptual right now. And if you don't mind, I would really like to revisit some of these ideas about leadership, but I would really like to introduce you right now.
I think it's really important to not jump to knowing too fast. I think it's good to keep a mind that doesn't feel it needs to have the answers right away. I don't think we've been in this situation before, so the past will not have the lessons. And when you ask about leadership and the old models of leadership aren't maybe going to work, some aspects maybe will be working, then it's more like just a little bit like groping in the dark, and in your own feelings for what's most important right now for me to do, what's most compelling, most nourishing too. And I think we lead by example, and we lead through our own commitment. If possible, wholehearted commitment to something. And I think that we now live in a world where it becomes pretty clear that our responses will always be partial. The idea that anybody can grasp the whole and have a clear idea about it, devise a plan, and then make that happen is actually the greatest kind of violence that we can add on top of what we're already doing. Whenever conceptual consciousness starts operating simply through the mode of operation of thinking consciousness, we take ourselves out from the situation and create an objectified world that then can be dealt with. And I think one of the most important mental postures is to get inside, to let a thinking emerge that doesn't first separate and then do something to things, but a mind that starts to think from within or with things. Yeah, and this mind that starts to think from within things is also strangely and disturbingly limited and partial. It is one-sided because I'm doing things from my side, and I'm in a conversation with things, and they are revealing something from their side, and all parts together form a whole, but actually I think we need to give a lot more attention to the parts.
Great.
Let me just say one more thing. So leading by example is less about content, is less about, I'm doing this and you should do it too. It's more, I think, through attitude that can be inspiring and can be picked up, where each person will find what is most important for them to do with a certain kind of attitude. And in Buddhism, by the way, I don't think of Buddhism as a kind of sect, religion. Very briefly, I think a Buddhist teaching is really governed by just 4 tenets. It's that transformation is possible. It's possible to be free of suffering, of unnecessary suffering. That it's possible to live for the benefit of all beings, which isn't altruism. All beings includes yourself. And that it's possible to live in accord with how things actually exist, which means to free yourself from delusion. Those 4 tenets are not dependent on much. They are, there's something you can hold with just possibilities. It's possible, transformation is possible, freedom from suffering is possible, living for the benefit of all beings is possible, and living in accord with how things actually exist. And then we verify whether that can actually be true. So it's very modest, actually, humble. Just to look into that. And what we do, and so I mentioned Buddhism because ordination in Buddhism to make your life work within the framework of these 4 tenets is considered, or the main metaphor in Japanese Zen Buddhism is home leaving. So you leave your familial and cultural surroundings, and you decide to live an intentional life. And I think at this, you mentioned this moment that we're in. I wonder if it's necessary for all of us to begin to live an intentional life, to leave the familiar and live an intentional life. Make your life about something. live for the benefit of all beings. But what I find very interesting and disturbing is it's going to be very partial. It's going to be something, not everything. So we make room for everyone to do something, and in that way we do everything. Not I'm doing everything and I'm telling you that you must do that too, but something that we feel we have the strength and capacity to do, and do that wholeheartedly.
Yeah, I think in a very interesting way to conduct the needed change that needs to happen in the world. My experience is that there's a huge change that needs to happen, and it seems that it's way beyond arm's length, the instruments and tools that we need for that change to happen. So there's a big, as you said, we don't have any more time, but we have all the time. So although what I hear from you, the three of you, are indications of knowledge and venturing into wisdom, meaning it's clear that there is understanding amongst people. It's clear for me that amongst the three of you, there is great wisdom. On the other hand, are we going to be observers of a crash? Are we going to watch the world be destroyed? Because the means to make that change are far from our hands. Are we going to isolate ourselves here in Crestone and make a group? Or how do we deal with that? So I understand and I believe just as much as what I hear, that leadership needs to be revised, needs to be revisited, as you said, Chris. But we are facing a huge, not paradox, a big contradiction in front of us for the world. So that is, for instance, not only youth, but all groups of people on the planet, because the awareness of the need of change is present. It's not there's a group of people saying that, no, change is not needed, we can follow. Even the most, I don't like the word used in that context, the most capitalist organization today, the most greedy organization today, is aware that, time has come for a change. But even these organizations are lacking a set of tools and means to implement such a change. And that's the turning point moment that we're living in. And I think that that's what interests me when it's put to me, how do we live in harmony with the planet in the global change moment, in the moment that we are. And I think that that's the provocation that I'd like to hear from you as to how do we go over the next decade. One of the things that I thought was very interesting about a conversation yesterday is a poll. One of them asked, well, what do you think would be, from 1 to 10, the chances that this change will happen? And it was pretty scary, So the answers are pretty scary. And I'm sure that if I put that to you, the result of the answers that I would get from that question would be pretty scary. So this is the provocation I like to lead for the next moment until we get another, and there's no order of speaking here. Now you can, please.
I just wanted to throw out some specific ideas that I mentioned about the leaderless revolution. And part of it is stuff that I read, but it's also what I've experienced, and I've really tried to incorporate that. And it's basically 4 simple ideas. In an increasingly interconnected system, such as what we have now, emerging in the 21st century, the action of one individual or small group can affect the whole system very rapidly. An example, the start of a wave by one person at a football stadium can quickly involve the entire crowd. The most powerful are right beside us and sitting together in this very moment. You know, we can think of African American women like Rosa Parks, and there were other women at that time who refused to move to the back of the bus in the 1950s and 60s. Modern network theory shows how one action can rapidly trigger change throughout the whole system. Second simple idea. It is action that convinces us, not words. A good theater director has always known this. Show, don't tell. Calling people to action does matter, and I have personally experienced this for over 30 years, very intimately. At this point in time, I can't tell you the thousands, and really, I would even have to say in some instances, hundreds of thousands of people that I have been involved with on an issue. And to protect the environment. And just to give a few examples, because I know most people know that here, and I promise I'll be very quick. But SLV Valley residents, led by the farmers and ranchers in this valley, proclaimed a resounding no to the American Water Development Incorporated Water Trans-Basin Diversion Scheme. We fought it through the courts, in the media, through research, engineering, and science to prove impact to our aquifer system. That 12-year bipartisan effort, directed by public will, and most of you sitting in this room, resulted in the 2000 Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve Act legislation that got passed through Congress, converting that privately owned ranch, which was exposed to corporate raiding, into public lands in the Baca National Wildlife Refuge and the Baca Mountain Tract, and it is now being managed for nature. People can say, well, the next batch of water developers are trying it again. So, and next Wednesday, by the way, there's a public meeting at the Saguache County Road and Bridge, and they're going to hear public comment at 6 o'clock to tell the next exploiter no. But, and this is a big but, there are now so many more obstacles that exist legally on the regulatory level that have been put in place on the county, state, and federal level to the Secretary of the Department of Interior that did not exist 30 years ago. So people have been working, and they've been working really hard to develop an infrastructure to stop this insanity. 58,000 acres of recommended wilderness are now right behind Chumé. That happened with the forest plan. Just in the last couple of years, we pushed really hard for that to happen. And it's going to be this fall, but they're going to say, hey, do you really want that to happen? And we're going to say, yes, we do. We want that designated wilderness to come all the way down to the border of our community, because that really removes any sort of exploitation. And we want that continuity of landscape. We want that continuity and wildlife corridor, and we're going to do everything we can to maintain that, to protect wildlife, because wildlife needs to be able to stay up there and be protected. Oil and gas drilling, we stopped it. It's been tried 5 times majorly in this valley, and we stopped it. 2 times through public process, 3 times the Ecosystem Council took it to court, but we stopped it. Now, we're not low-hanging fruit. I'll be honest with you, like other geologic areas throughout Colorado, but they were looking, and we had to make sure, and the farmers and ranchers, again, the whole valley, were all connected. Crestone's not going to exist by itself. We got to connect with the valley, and we got to show them that we're not neurotic nut jobs, and that we really want to help the farmers and ranchers in this valley. Anyway, just so you know, at one point, there were 47,000 comments that responded to the Baca National Wildlife Refuge exploitation plan to do exploratory drilling. Does anybody remember that? You know who funded that to occur so that we could take it to court and go through probably 5 years of process and hire the best possible attorneys to help us? You know who helped us? Shumei. The membership, people from Japan helped us. They may not be able to come here, but they understood how important this was. And we are incredibly grateful to them. And there's just a few more, sorry. Public engagement and planning. Decision-making is better when it is more inclusive and directed towards the people most affected. I support representational democracy, but it has to be coupled with and stay engaged, and we have to stay engaged with it, electing people who understand our needs and interests and actually have the skill set to follow it through. But that is not enough. That's not enough anymore, everybody. We cannot expect people to take care of it for us. We have to be involved. Large numbers of people in different bioregions, watersheds, communities of interest need to make decisions for themselves. And when that happens, the results are remarkable. Policies become fairer. More responsibility and trust in society comes about only by giving real decision-making responsibility to us as citizens. This is the only way that decision-making can become more transparent and less corrupt. When people assume their own personal power and responsibility, it is mostly used more wisely and peacefully. Anyway. That's just this morning.
That's exactly
this has been a great opportunity for me
No,
to
this is
actually
exactly the.
Okay.
No, it's the right moment, the right place. But at the same time, how do we link that? And I think that's what you prompt in this conversation. How do we link with the higher point of view, with the higher, not that this is low at all, on the contrary, that's, I understand from you, and I live in Brazil, and one of my jobs is to care for the Amazon, and this is a major issue, which I'm going to speak a little bit tomorrow. But the big question here is, how do we continue in this evolutionary process of a civilized society that can go either this way or that way? And how do we link what I hear from you, which is an activism of a very high caliber that is able to look into this valley and see that yesterday was worse, now it's better, because we came to the place, because we did something. Now, how do we take the next step? Because the forces that you just described that were won, the forces that you were able to defeat, if you will, are still there.
Exactly.
And I'm not talking about living in a world of good and evil. And that's where I think,
Right.
I see him moving
Because
his
I drove
body.
here.
He's going to throw his...
Look, we don't know how we're going to do it.
But we've got some good ideas.
Okay, I want to say something to Christine's activist stance here. Very important work. Jonah Macy, who is a Buddhist teacher and activist, distinguishes three kinds of approaches. One is holding action in defense of life, which is, a pipeline is being built, you block it in defense of life. Second one is structural change. So let's say we are switching from fossil fuels to renewables. And that's structural change. It's complicated work. Somebody needs to do that. And the third one is changing minds. And it's all three are necessary. And it's often that when you are doing one kind of work, somebody will say, yeah, but you have to also do this. And then you have to do that. And it's very difficult to be with the disturbance of saying, I can only do something. And here's an activist, and my main line of work is to change minds. So I'm going to do less activism and less holding action in defense of life. So there's not one approach.
Absolutely.
I want to say something else. I'm neither pessimistic nor optimistic. Both those are one-sided. I think we go back and forth. Sometimes we're optimistic, sometimes we're pessimistic. It's just the mind is taking sides. It's not reality, it's just what we want to feel that moment. But I think we're dealing with something much more profound than just adjusting something little. And I'm concerned about the romanticization of nature, and I'm concerned about the idealization of indigenous populations. Because when you study the history and what the fossil record shows, when humans settled Australia 45,000 years ago, they drove 90% of the megafauna of Australia extinct.
Well, here too.
And when they settled America 14,000 years ago, at not the same kind of scale, but 70 to 80% of the megafauna in both North and South America went extinct. Nobody has clean hands. This is very disturbing. And when the agricultural revolution happened 12,000 years ago, things got worse.
Well, but it created a lot of stability.
Yeah, and it drove up populations because food supplies were stable. And when
Right.
those food supplies had to be stabilized more and more, the Industrial Revolution made things worse 200 years ago. And we live in an age of mass extinction. Some estimates say that potentially by the end of this century, 25 to 50% of all life forms will be extinct. And we are responsible. This is not some small adjustment that we can think up in our heads. Like what we're going to do about that. I want to give, like I sit with, my main practice is to sit with disturbance. This stuff. Plastic.
I told you not to talk about this.
So, when I say romanticization of nature is, typically we think nature is outside. What's in the house is not nature, and nature is outside. We protect things outside. We need to develop ecological awareness. So my approach here is we are already profoundly ecological. We may not know it, but ecological means we are coexisting with all life forms, including plastic. And we are in a relationship with plastic. And we need to cultivate our relationship with plastic, not just with trees. I do wild Dharma trips where I take people, different from John, but we go into wild places. And that's inspiring. But recently I asked my community, who is interested in going to the landfill? We need a relationship to plastic. I mean, we need to experience it just as much as we need to experience wild nature.
Well, and that, speaking of that connection, there were about 40 people who went to the Saguache landfill and basically redirected 180 cubic yards, which is it's like 3/4 of a football field, of plastic, paper, and glass and put it in roll-offs to take it to a material recovery facility in Denver to be reprocessed. So that's one relationship.
That's activism, yeah. That's good.
It is
And
good.
what I'm talking about is when I use plastic,
Yep.
I realize that my individual action is statistically so insignificant that it feels okay to open this bottle and drink from it and then throw it away, this magical place away. As if there was an away. We now know that when plastic breaks down and interferes with our endocrine system, we are the away place. Everything cycles back and is in our bodies. Plastic particles, nuclear materials, all sorts of pollution isn't away, it's all coming back here. There's no place away. We're profoundly ecological. So what I mean is, I personally am not guilty of the pollution of the oceans with plastic. You all heard about this. It's shocking, right? It ends up in all sorts of life forms ingested, killing animals. But all of us together, consuming plastic like we do, are causing this. And this profound paradox of that my personal actions can feel so peaceful and taken together, like every time I turn on the ignition, but together are massively destructive, is profoundly disturbing to me. And I don't have an answer for this. But I think without exposing our hearts and minds to this disturbance, which is everywhere. I'm just doing a renovation with my wife of our kitchen and living space. And you buy some materials. It's all, made from oil, wrapped in plastic. Somebody I like to read, Timothy Morton, talks about the beautiful soul syndrome, which is, I feel so interconnected with everything, but not with the oil and gas industry, and not with the people who are producing the plastic. They're evil. But here I'm sitting, because I want some water, and that's supplied. I'm not protesting it.
So John, I will, not because you're the wisest in the group, but I think the issue of integration on what these two ideas that were exposed by Chris and Chris Square, how do we make sense of this? I've been recently exposing myself a little bit to the economist of Sweden called Hans Rosling. And he's a very creative economist. I don't know if people have seen his YouTube presentations, where he tries to get facts together and demonstrate that we're way better than we think we are. He has a speech that he's not optimist in a way, but he said, I think we are sometimes missing, throwing the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. And there's so much that we have improved in our planet due to our ingenuity and our ability of engineering and all that the human spirit is full of. And at the same time, we look, and my conclusion to that sometimes is that, well, this is an economist type of view, where you get all the elements of health, education, ability to feed society, and so forth. But at the same time, economy doesn't look to the planet in a way that perhaps it should, and maybe this is a turning point issue that's coming together. But how do we bring to, let's say, to people who come on a quest, on exposing themselves to an alone time in nature, that aspect of integration, or you can rephrase my question in any other way, but that aspect of integration of these two ideas, how do we go about them? Pat?
Yeah, beautiful question. A lot of my background is in Taoism. And it's interesting, in the Taoist system, we don't talk so much about enlightenment. We talk about becoming a naturally integrated one. That's kind of an ultimate level of realization in the Taoist pantheon. I always thought it was interesting in the Taoist view, the invitation or the opportunity is to become a fully integrated being. And that means become fully integrated with outer nature, with inner nature, and a connection or an opening to your true nature or source. And the integration is something that's accomplished in part in the Taoist way through making authentic connections to nature, to deepening and strengthening the connections to the elements, to the plants, to the animals, to the ecosystems. So you begin to have a shift of your view from a particularized consciousness that Christian talked very well about to a whole field kind of awareness. For example, you can choose, when you're seeing, you can choose to see just piece by piece, or you can choose to see with the whole eye, the entire eye. When I was growing up, my grandfather, who was part traditional, he taught me to go out and track by first noticing the specific way an animal left a track in the forest, and then to see it in the context of the whole field of the forest, the way the ferns were laying, the way the plants were behaving. And over time, I gradually shifted from just seeing one piece here, one piece there, another piece over there, to seeing the entire field. Now, it wasn't as sharp, but I was able to begin to see what was arising in the entire field of my visual perception. And that, I think, was actually a really good foundation for what led me to become an ecologist and an ecosystem ecologist, specializing, by the way, in tropical ecology. And he opened up for me the realization that through a simple shift of awareness, I could begin to see, not piece by piece, and which strengthens the separative, non-integrated kind of consciousness, but it began to open up the integrated, connected, whole system kind of consciousness and awareness. And I'm very, very grateful for him. That came from the traditional people. And I want to return a little bit just for a moment. Part of our challenge or our opportunity is to honor the fact that along with the loss of species diversity that you both laid out very powerfully, we forget that we're destroying the tremendous cultural diversity of those cultures that have learned how to live in harmony and balance with their ecosystem and with the rest of the planet. This is one of the greatest losses in diversity right now. So part of the challenge or the opportunity is to value and honor and learn from those indigenous systems of wisdom that have gone very deep into their local ecosystem and received tremendous teachings from it, which is essentially what we're doing with the Way of Nature, by the way. We're trying to find what are those teachings, what are the core principles that they have in common, what's the processes that support the arising of that wisdom, how do we connect with it in our modern contemporary culture? And then, having done that, how can we begin to communicate it authentically and powerfully? You probably all saw this film, Avatar, right? Wasn't it amazing how powerful that film shifted a lot of people's awareness? One film. Imagine if we had a film that led people back into nature and supported their making a profound connection through the visual arts, the auditory refinement, and the honoring of these amazing senses that we're gifted with, and having those as the focal point for meditation. So they refine, and you go deeper and deeper. You don't have to go out on a week-long solo to do that. You can do that in one day, and just go out for an afternoon.
That leads us, I think we're getting close to, how are we doing with time here?
Got 35 minutes.
Oh, that's good. Because, no, but you're going to jump in exactly in the same mind frame that I setting up, which is this. He reads my mind all the time. And he got my question before I made them twice yesterday. I'm not kidding. But the integration that we spoke and speak, and you very beautifully indicated that the native wisdom that is available and out there, I mean, how does we pitch? How do we reach for this integration of spirituality and nature, you know?
Let me mention one thing, if I could, about that. Part of the challenge And part of the invitation is to drop out of our human culture,
Drop out.
drop out of our normal human culture for a while, and allow nature to speak to us. In most indigenous cultures, powerful relationships are developed with plants, animals, and the elements. They begin to speak to you. You receive the teachings and the wisdom of those other beings of life. How can we come back into balance if we're not in communication? The process of communication is very straightforward. It is not an accident that every single indigenous culture goes out alone into nature for a period of time and makes profound connection with the rest of life and allows the space, especially in the teenage years. But it's also done at different phases in life. So at the different phases when you're getting a family, when you're beginning to become an elder and you're taking on responsibilities for the broader culture, when you're preparing for death. These are also times of transformation where we're going and doing a vision quest as part of the process. So we need to take, we're all indigenous to this planet. We all are potentially indigenous people. We all are indigenous to a particular ecosystem if we have a deeply rooted home. And we need to learn the basic techniques and approaches for reconnecting with place, with nature, with our local ecosystem. It's no accident Christcal has the Ecosystem Council. That's a word that describes an entire living system. And how do we use our God-given gifts of sight and sound and taste and smell and touch, the experience of movement, the experience of sensing the life force, and even the way that thoughts and emotions display in the mind? How do we work with that creatively to begin to bond and explore our connection with the rest of life and our local system? So we can do it, and it's not complicated. You don't have to go out and do a month-long solo or a week-long vision quest. You can do it in an afternoon where you consciously drop out and drop in. You drop into connection. And it's a simple process. There are very simple guidelines that come from all the traditional cultures that we can follow, and we can bring in the great teachings from Buddhism and Taoism, and as well as Native American way and the Judaic pathways, and find the common ground principles from those that also often share, especially a path to source, and work with them in a very creative way and begin to open outer nature connections, authentic connection to the true nature or the inner nature aspect of yourself where all these perceptions reside and the emotions and thoughts. And finally, if you follow it back into the place where all that originates and manifests and back into which it dissolves when it's finished, of course that leaves you back in the pristine state of natural awareness. And so it helps to reveal the face of Source.
So I'm fascinated how we often say, what are we going to do? And we know exactly what to do. We absolutely know what to do. We live in an age of mass extinction. And the three megatrends that coalesce to make mass extinction happen, roughly speaking, is global warming, the most urgent, global pollution, and overpopulation. And we know exactly what to do. We have to stop emitting carbon. We have to imagine a waste-free life, which means, what is waste? Waste is that which cannot be broken down by other life forms or not fast enough so that it becomes poisonous to other life forms. So we basically have to create a culture that works with biodegradable materials. We know that. It's not this stuff. And we need to educate women and girls so that they can be women who choose to have fewer babies. That's shown in many studies that that's the most effective tool we have to control human population. Why is human population a problem? Because we spread out and we don't leave enough room for non-human life forms. One of the most fascinating and disturbing facts about my life, because I grew up in Germany and I was affected by the Chernobyl nuclear catastrophe, is the area, hundreds of thousands of square miles around the reactor in Chernobyl is uninhabitable for humans, we think. But other life forms inhabit it. And there's terrible birth defects. But the megafauna is coming back, the bears, the wolves. The species who repopulate the Chernobyl area are sick, or the individuals are sick, but the species are healthy because they have room to live. We have to get out of the way. We have to educate girls. And what I mean by educate girls is bring education to many more girls and basically end patriarchy. And then we have to do radical conservation so that the areas in which humans live is confined, and there are other areas where other life forms can flourish. So Chernobyl is a terrible way to do that, but it works. So we know what to do. And so why are we not doing it? And it's because we are entangled.
Right.
We are deeply and disturbingly entangled in systems that are much larger than each of us. So this is being called hyperobjects. Hyperobjects are let's call it hyperrealities. Hyperrealities are so massively distributed in time and space that we can always only notice a sliver of it. I'll give a quick example is we can notice the weather, but we can't really notice the climate. Climate is something that's distributed in time in such a way that we have no perceptual immediacy of it. This is very difficult to deal with. And so any effort anyone can make in their particular sphere of influence, there are presidents of nation states, there are leaders of companies, and then there are us ordinary folks. But each of us has a sphere of influence, and in that sphere of influence, you can do what needs to be done as much as possible, step by step, wholeheartedly. I mean, for me, it's disturbing every day. The other day, I was trying to clean our kitchen stove, big commercial range, and I was reaching for the brush that we use to do that with, and there was no brush. Somebody used it. It was used up, and so it was thrown to this magical place away. And then I said to someone who was in the kitchen, "Is the brush anywhere?" And he says, "Oh, just get a new one." So I go to the pantry and I pull out a new brush. We're well stocked. It's made of plastic. And I'm looking at this thing, and I don't want to use it. And there it is. And it's purchased at Walmart, because that's where you purchase stuff. And I was wondering, is anyone making wooden brushes? When I was in the 70s in Germany, there were still wooden brushes. I remember holding them in my hand. I can remember having wooden brushes.
They're around.
Yeah, but you have, what I'm saying is, you actually have to search for them. Like, where are those wooden brushes? What I'm saying is, we're part of these, consumer capitalism is a hyperobject, and it needs us to consume the stuff that it makes. And there's no way we're just going to step out of it and say, oh, it's just going to end. So what my practice is to connect with what John is saying. I resonate with it very much. There's the attention to the particular, and there's the attention to the field. And the field speaks to us differently. But we also, I think, being located in the field, we also want to be in resonance with the particular, and both with so-called natural things and also with so-called artificial things. And there's, what I find is there is resonance and there's disturbance, and that disturbance is actually motivating me to act. I can only, there's only so much I can do, but it's very motivating. It's very motivating when, not just when I'm in nature, but like when I go to the city and I'm surrounded by, cars that make the air bad. I'm very motivated to not do that. I'm not just motivated to not be there, but to realize that this can't go on. Just the way I'm motivated to not engage more in this plastic world. It's hard. I don't think there's easy answers to that. But sitting with disturbance means to open your body and mind to a resonance that isn't just contemplating the beautiful stuff. It's also contemplating that which is ugly and abject and disturbing, because we need to see that. We put it in this magical place away and separate ourselves from it, and that's part of the problem. Because it's surrounding us, and it's penetrating our bodies, and we can't get away from it. So it's better to actually go right to it. As some people have suggested how to deal with nuclear materials, gold is actually a wonderful material to absorb radiation. So some people have said, let's put the nuclear materials not in some sort of abandoned salt mines. Let's put them right in the marketplace encased in gold. Because we will have to take care of them. We will have to take care of them for tens of thousands of years. Yep. The half-life of plutonium is 24,000 years, folks. What are we This is what we're dealing with. We have to deal with, and we are making more of it to combat global warming. There's so many people, including the guy who's leading our rural electric co-op, who are so for nuclear power because it's, there's no CO2 emissions, but then, let's put those gold encasements right there where we have direct access to take care of them.
Jump in?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try and address a lot of the things that he brought up on three different levels. First, the feminine, and education of everyone, men and women being elevated clearly, and I mean by elevated to be understood and respected. And but I'm talking about the feminine that exists in all of us. We need to really give that more time. We're nurtured to be, even women in this culture are nurtured to be masculine. And, this is interesting for me because I had 5 brothers, and I was in the middle. And thank God my parents had my back. And they really encouraged me to be myself and to not, take stuff. But the reality is, I saw these really sensitive guys who were forced to do all these horrible things, to have to prove their masculinity. And it was so disgusting to me growing up. I mean, and there was like enough, the stories are unbelievable, but because it was a working class neighborhood. But anyway, that being said, everyone around the world, men, young boys and girls and boys, transgender, sexuality in general, we really need to just respect where we're coming from and allow a space for people to be themselves. And I've spent my life trying to nurture that, and I think that's so important, and education is so important, and treating each other with respect is so important. And then there's water. You were talking about, this infrastructure that we're supposed to, what is this infrastructure that we're going to create? It's here. The infrastructure's here. You know that. And it's just a matter of looking at that kaleidoscope and shifting it and looking at the pattern differently. But the infrastructure's here. We're just going to have to start looking at it very differently than how we've been looking at it and realize, oh my gosh, this was being served for this purpose? we need to repurpose it now and use it for this other purpose. And we can do that, and we're really good at that because we're really good managers, we're really good coordinators. We have to become much better at it, but there is no control. And as soon as that mindset starts coming up, it's like, you know, that critical voice that's unrelenting. We have to like find a way to like say, hey, you know, you need to step over here now because I'm going to listen to these other voices instead. Because that critical voice is unrelenting and it's destroying us. It's destroying us, and we have to look at it a different way. And
Are you criticizing criticism right now?
I am embracing.
A little bit.
I am
It's okay.
embracing criticism and putting it to bed so I can take a nice nap.
Okay.
For the moment. But anyway, but the river. I had the opportunity. I was taken on this amazing trip to Stony Pass, which is supposed to be the headwaters where the Rio Grande starts. And I'm like, oh, you know, I thought I was going to see this amazing place where, you know, the river started. And I start looking around, and it's thousands and thousands and thousands of places. And it just starts coming together and feeding and becoming into one place. And that's what it is. It's not one place. It's not one idea. It's not one way. It's going to just be this organism that we're going to move with and through. And it's going to be connected by love and understanding. And we're going to, like, shepherd it along.
Well, Chris, although I completely agree with you, there's nothing to disagree, so there's no but. I think the moment, I don't know who invented the word in the context that we're living today, disruption, that we need to create a disruptive culture. And this has been, in a way, I mean, I don't know if it's the mind of the inventor that creates something new, and that newness change something. And we need to coexist with tradition and the newness, and how do you converge, integrate that? And I think this, you know, I deeply respect Shumei and the Japanese culture, and, you know, I've been learning a lot from Stephen. I've been interacting a lot with Stephen in Brazil. And this, the way of keeping something steady as the drum that was playing. There was Koji Sensei was, you know, he was beating like steady. Is he here? I don't know, speaking about him. But he was beating steady while everybody else was doing some crazy stuff. Some were making even mistakes in the middle. And then, you know, and then when everything finished, the player gets a stick from the bottom of the drum. And I said, oh, he prepared for an error in the process. The stick may break, and he would have one ready. So you prepare for something, you know, at the same time for the new that needs to happen and disrupt, you know, your play. And so how do you deal with that messy situation that we're living on today, and disruption versus or with keeping it going? You know, are we observers, not observers? I think I'd like to sort of have a sense in terms of this integrative idea of how we bring all of these thousands or 5,000 sources of water for the Rio Grande that you create this metaphor into something that has singularity. We talk a lot about singularity today.
Give it up.
How do you do that? Oh,
Give up the singularity.
you always get my...
Give up the whole. Give up the singularity. It's a fantasy. It's, you know, integration is a fantasy. It's, you know, there are contradictory feelings about everything at all times. And there are contradictory point of views. When you bring thinking consciousness to it, it's this or that. We are in, you know, we have all the time and we have no time. And what I think is like the mind that we actually need is to not feel so compelled to take sides. Not feel so compelled to take sides. And one of the maturings that I see as profoundly necessary is to be more comfortable and willing to experience profound ambiguity. So when Christine says, yeah, it's all there and we just have to repurpose it, and then I listen and I say, yeah. And
John wants to
really,
jump in.
we just need that little adjustment? Really? Is that true? So we need that adjustment, so let's make it. And we'll see whether that's enough. And we may have to come up with more profound changes too. So I'm not the one to decide that. So we're going to live that situation. And you're going to do your work, and other people are going to do their work.
Well, I was just going to share that in this question, or the answer to the question you posed about how do we move with an integrated experience given the chaotic circumstances that we all deal with day by day. And one of the most valuable experiences I ever had was the training I had in the martial arts, especially in Tai Chi and Bagua and Xingyi. And Aikido has many of the same capacities. One of the beautiful things about that kind of training is that it teaches you how to remain completely relaxed, open, and connected in a state that is emotionally and physically confrontive. I'll give you one recent example in my life. I was in Costa Rica. They were doing a film on the way of nature. Some folks came over from Holland to do the film. We went down to a little place in the tropical forest there in Costa Rica to do the filming. The woman who was the filmmaker was up on top of a rock doing the filming. And as we were beginning to go through the various core principles of the training, and the one I was working on was relaxation, deepening into a complete experience of flowing, letting go into life, and then finally complete surrender into what's arising in the here and now, which is a sequence we work quite a bit with, combined with presence. And I was just kind of getting into that on this video when a band of about half a dozen banditos, probably high on crack and stuff like that, or speed, jumped out of the forest and surrounded us. They ran up to the boulder in which she was doing the filming and ran over to me with knives, and they put a knife to her belly. And she had, I realized, maybe milliseconds to live, depending on, in part, my response. And I knew if I used some of my martial training to respond, she'd be dead, because I wasn't that fast. So I had no choice but to do exactly what I was teaching on, completely surrender to the here and now of what was arising in the moment. So that's what I did. And I got, of course, pounded and beat up pretty bad, but as the guy was beating me up, I remember I dropped into a very peaceful space. And actually there was some really beautiful heart energy in that space. And this guy was looking into my eyes and I was looking into his as he was punching me. And I remember seeing into his eyes and he was incredibly contracted. His pupils were just narrowed down to tiny little things. And I felt very open, very spacious, and actually I had a lot of compassion for the pain he must be feeling. And then later on I thought to myself, what did he see? Well, I remember my state, I was deeply relaxed, totally surrendered. And he saw that. In that moment, he stopped everything. He called to his companions to take the knife away. He gathered them all up and they ran away into the forest and disappeared. So that's a little story from a recent event in my life, just a year or two ago. It took me, of course, a year or two to recover my body from the beating, but that's another story.
Well, it's great that, as my sense is that we're going to walk out of here exactly the way we walked in. But on the other hand, we're going to be completely different. And that ambiguity is what, puts a needle on the right point, on the right dot to create the evolution or evolvement or whatever word in English you may have. and I think the lessons that, I speak for myself because I'm here as a moderator, not as a, but I speak for myself in terms of the opportunity that something of a deep conversation such as this offers me, and I hope that touches the heart of everyone. The only person in this room that I hope it goes a little deeper is my daughter. But that's because I'm a father. But I really think that the change that needs to occur in the world is happening. From reports that we get, from approaches that we have, from the dismantling of the approach of fear. Normally we get this idea that we need a big change in the world because we are afraid that the world's going to collapse in front of us. And the example of Chernobyl is something very powerful without judging it. But bringing it up, I think it was very wise because I've studied that case a little bit in terms of what's going on and because biodiversity is one of my main topics. And to understand such a thing, the use of agrochemicals in Brazil, where I've been dealing with that kind of thing. Sometimes I get to the point where I need to look in the eyes of the beast and just say, okay, I surrender, There's nothing I can do here, and that's exactly what needs to be done, So, although I don't take a message from the three of you that don't do nothing or do nothing, type of approach. I mean, the doing is this. And I'm very thankful for the opportunity, and I hope that this is a step that we're building on top of one another and one after the other. I worked for the Brazilian government for 2 years. I was the director for the Department of Protected Areas. And it was desperation every day, The protection of the Amazon and the entire, we have 7 biomes, different biomes in Brazil. Under my belt were 140 million hectares for 2 years that I had to look after and create a connectivity program for that. And it was despairing all the time, as what to do, So, but I was so thankful. I think what you brought in one of your phrases was, it's there. We just need to make better use of the structure that we have available to us. I walked out of the Brazilian government position that I had thinking that we have a wonderful government, but we need leadership. We need the leaders to be changed because the direction that you take a certain structure, the direction you give to your steering wheel is where, what's going to happen. It's going to be destructive or constructive.
I trust the human condition, I really do, and I have to just say that. There's, going to be 8 billion of us, and to me, why are there so many of us here right now? And I really believe that may be the reason and how consciousness will shift. Maybe, and maybe it's, 1 billion of that, or whatever it is, the magic billion number. But to me, I just feel like there's so much consciousness to be awakened right now. Let's just try.
I'd like to turn the word back to Matthew, 5 more minutes, or
is this the,
I don't know if John and Chris, would you like to have some final words as well? I think it's a great opportunity that we're all together.
To share something from our little way of nature process. Maybe I should do it after these folks have done their final closing piece. It's probably more appropriate after they've finished.
Well, when you speak about final words, I have to bring some Zen stuff.
Bring up, think of that.
There's no final word. the conversation always continues. So let that be what I have to say. Go ahead.
I'm good.
Okay, now
See
we do
this-
get the
this
final
beautiful
word.
picture. This is taken from our little publication on cultivating the three natures. And this is what we do when we begin any sharing together, any process together. And I thought it might be a nice way to share this with you all. Not to say you should do this, but just to share with you something of what we're up to. And maybe it will inspire you in some way. And I'm sharing this in the spirit of kind of an invitation to consider how we might shift our relationship with nature through the power of intent. In shamanism, the power of intent is really important. And the key difference between intent and will is that with will, it's forced by the ego. With intent, it arises out of a natural, compassionate service to be of service to the broader whole, the broader system. And when that intent arises, we'd say a compassionate intent, then it's placed in the field of infinite possibilities and released 100%, completely. It has to be a complete letting go of any attachment to the end result. There's a surrender into the field of the end result. And that's where the magic happens. And that's kind of where that's kind of the fundamental invitation in the shamanic pathway. It's the mastery of that. So these vows are in that spirit. These are our refuge vows. I take refuge. Thanks, a little water. In the outer, inner, and absolute teacher. I take refuge in the ultimate spiritual truth and the teachings that reveal it. Plastic can be helpful. I take refuge in our spiritual community and in the path it affords to deeper spiritual realization. I take refuge in the sacred sphere of awakened awareness for the happiness and liberation from suffering for all beings. I generate compassion for all beings and vow to serve their joy and enlightenment. I promise to serve bringing harmony, balance, and ecological integrity to my fellow humans and their relationship with all living beings. I honor and serve the equality of life in all its forms. I vow to accomplish liberation and enlightenment in this lifetime for the sake of all beings. Oh.
And if we lacked any word, an idea, I just would like to offer a final sound to all of you, if I may take a little moment and play something for you. Thank you very much for coming, and I hope to see you sometime. Matthew?
I'm wiping tears from my eyes. I shall not attempt to have any last word. I will, however, plug a book. Yeah, actually, some friends are in the audience. I was visiting recently down in Ojo Caliente, and this book was lying on their table, and Bill Elsie was with me and a couple of Japanese friends. And yeah, if you haven't heard about it, most of the panelists, well, some knew, some didn't. Anyway, it's called Drawdown. It's edited by Paul Hawken. It's the 100 most substantive solutions to reverse global warming based on meticulous research by leading scientists and policymakers around the world. I think most of you are interested in today's topic, so if you haven't heard about it, you may be interested in that book. Thank you. Actually, you know, I don't know, at the risk of a last word, I and many of us honestly had no idea what would happen. We didn't even really know what a panel was. As Warwick pointed out to me, oh, well, you're going to have a panel. That's a word. It's something. It's like, oh, this is what happened. You know, I hope you have questions. I hope you have disagreements. I hope you have passions that might have been elicited by the last hour and 45 minutes. And I really, again, I think we all encourage you to start those conversations right now when you leave. And the conversation certainly isn't over. It's just begun. So next, we have a Sampai prayer for world peace that will, when I say it will begin at 6 o'clock, it begins precisely at 6 o'clock. My recommendation would be to be back in here and be seated by about 6:30. I think there will be a little, I'm sorry, did I say 6:30? Whoa, thank you. Reality check. And as he stares at his watch, 5:30. So you've got about a half an hour. Take it outside. The sun is shining. Breathe some fresh air. Start asking each other those questions. For anybody who may not be coming back for the Sampai tonight, just quick rundown of tomorrow's activities. The Shumei International Institute's 17th anniversary Sampai will begin at 10:30 here in this space tomorrow morning. Again, as parking can be somewhat challenging, I'd suggest you come early, plan to be seated here by 10:30. I will greet you in my suit and fluorescent green vest. There will be a public luncheon after that, starting at about 12 o'clock. We have an art exhibition themed Living in Harmony with, I'm going to say Living as Nature. Come be nature in the art gallery. And then Warwick Manfrenato at 2, reality check, 2 o'clock? Thank you. His presentation, again, will be back here in this space at 2 o'clock, and I promise we will have some microphones and you can ask some questions. Thank you very much. Please, a round of applause again for our... We'll recycle your bottles. We're not going to throw them in the magical away place.